Hello, I'm Rod Peppiatt from the Avenue Uniting Church in Blackburn, Victoria. We meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. Today marks the point in the Christian calendar where which we call the Feast of Transfiguration. It's a miracle story in the Gospels. It's in some ways quite a strange story to modern hearing, but we listen to it and we attend to it because it is actually quite an important one in the narrative or in the flow of Mark's Gospel. So let me read to you from chapter 9 in Mark's Gospel, his story of the Transfiguration of Jesus. Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling bright, such as no one on earth could brighten them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He didn't know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. As I said, perhaps a strange story to 21st century hearing. It's a story that matters to Mark and to his gospel. And I believe it matters that we attend to his story of the Transfiguration. It's not simply there to emphasise Jesus' authority or to affirm that he's up there with the big boys of the people's faith history. That's part of it, certainly, but there's way more to it than that. The dazzling appearance, the clothes whiter than any earthly figure could make them, these are symbols, and they're here to spell out that in some deep and unfathomable way, heaven and earth come together for Mark in this man Jesus, this figure Jesus in the story. And that's a huge statement of faith. Mark embraces both what he can see in an earthly sense, I should say, in Jesus, and that which can only be experienced as holy mystery. And we remember that Mark, by the time he wrote, several decades had gone since the time of Jesus, and he had all of these stories to relate to and to draw on. The nature of the mystery that I just mentioned doesn't make sense for Mark by itself. He needs to ground it in his narrative by placing it within the history of Jesus' people, who are Mark's people as well. And in the symbolic presence of Moses and Elijah, Mark draws the story of Jesus from the past into the present, into his present. And perhaps in doing so, he's affirming that the nature and the presence of Yahweh, hidden or veiled in Moses and Elijah, is now being revealed in Jesus. We can't say that for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. But there's still more that Mark wants to say with this story. He and his readers, his people, his community know how the stories of Elijah and Moses played out. And now the gospel looks back from Mark's time after Jesus to show how the Jesus story unfolded. Mark's gospel is often called a passion narrative with a long introduction. And that's a way of saying that to understand Jesus' death in Mark, it was necessary to attend to the life that took him to Calvary. Without the life he lived and the way he did it, Jesus' death actually makes little sense. And so Mark, as he crafts his gospel, it demands our attention. As best we can, we need to see each story within the bigger picture of that gospel. And so here on the mountain with his friends, we see a story of Jesus firmly identified within the history of God's people. And then, shockingly, Mark links it with Jesus' teaching about his future treatment at the hands of the authorities. Now, of course, that makes no sense to his disciples, and nor is it meant to do within the narrative flow. They're not meant for the story. They're not meant to understand it at that point. It only makes sense when they look back on it. But what it does do is to make clear, I believe anyway, it makes clear that stories such as the Transfiguration are not meant to be seen in isolation from the other stories in the Gospel. Or to put it another way, if I can, the glorification type stories are not meant to be seen in isolation or abstraction from the earthier stories. Each give complexity and context and meaning to the other. By this I mean that the Transfiguration story is a vital part of the picture of Jesus that Mark paints. But if it's the only picture of him we allow, then we're left with a very one-dimensional Jesus. And for Mark, the holiness of the Transfiguration story is enhanced by the story of Jesus touching a man with leprosy, for instance, or a woman with a debilitating menstrual flow, or even Peter's dead mother-in-law. These things sit side by side. The Transfiguration is enhanced by the stories Jesus tells, by the people with whom he associates, by the way he challenges the religious authorities and even the secular authorities, claiming to speak for Yahweh, for God. Perhaps most profoundly for me is the moment of Jesus' death, when it all comes together for Mark. When Mark tells us that the temple curtain is torn apart and God is revealed for him, not behind the curtain, but out on the cross with the naked man killed by empire. We see that in Mark chapter 15. Friends, Transfiguration is vital, and it needs the other stories just as they need it. Together, that they tell that the one in whom God was seen in an extraordinary way understood how that presence was to be lived out. And it's important that we try to attend to the fuller picture that we have of the way that led Jesus throughout his life, right up to the cross. And in attending to those stories together, I think we more deeply see and experience the holy life that we call God reflected in Jesus. So what do we do with it? Sometimes I'm able to follow that, to be like him even. More often, probably, his example shames me. But even then, I hear a word of grace in that life, calling me to try again, to get up and have another go. For me, this week, this is the gift of the constant and the wonderful Jesus, as a friend of mine refers to him. Constant in the way of love and the insistence that this is the way of God, and wonderful in touching the reality of human life and touching the heavens. And for this gift, I give thanks. Amen. Blessings.